first of all, thank you all for coming. I never know what's going to happen. The first one could have been a fluke, but it looks like a lot of people found this relatively interesting, so I'm very grateful that you decided to come back and hear a little more. We will be speaking about a little less history chronologically in the same amount of time, so hopefully I'll be able to pace myself a little easier. I should thank, first of all, our sponsors, Dr. and Mrs. Ruben and Mandy Brecher, big supporters of scholarship in general. They've been very gracious in donating to the synagogue on behalf of this series, and we thank them very much. So let's pick up where we left off. Last week, we ended our discussion of the Jews in the ancient period, and these terms that I'm using, ancient, medieval, modern, and contemporary, they are really terms used in Western historiography, that is primarily 18th and 19th century Christian European historiography. That's the way that time is divided up. I mentioned last week how, there's like an ancient period, which is this classical Greek and Roman civilization. Then the Vandals come in the 5th century and they sack it, the Visigoths, and it's all gone. And then it's the Dark Ages. There's a big kind of like lull, a valley in civilization as a whole, and then it rises again in the Renaissance, the High Middle Ages, and so on. This is not necessarily the type of periodization we would use for Jewish history because, when the rest of the world was having the Dark Ages, we had Saadia Gaon. We had, tremendous intellect. We had phenomenal achievements. So it doesn't necessarily correspond to Jewish historiography, but we're working with these terms anyways. If we are to use those terms in our purposes, we should probably draw a seam, not with the destruction of the temple, although that was an incredibly traumatic experience. It's remarkable that the Jewish people survived it, but rather with the developments of the following century. Contrary to popular misconception, the Jews were not simply emptied out of Israel with the destruction of the temple. There were definitely tens of thousands of exiles who made their way, who were taken as enslaved ships to Rome. In the following century, there was another 2 revolts against the Romans. One in particular, the Bar Kokhba revolt, ended in disaster for the Jews, particularly in the environs of Jerusalem and points south. And so, as we shall see, Jewish population movement towards the north was extremely important for this period of time. And that's when you begin to see major movement of Jews outside of Israel, the fracturing of the community on demographic basis. The economy is ruined. Will the Jews be able to stay together as a people? And what we'll discuss today are 2 primary innovations, 2 extreme examples of Jewish resourcefulness that really made it possible for Jewish survival to extend through the Middle Ages. The challenges of the Middle Ages will be rather different when we get to the modern period, but we're going to basically follow the story of those 2 innovations. This map shows you roughly where the major centers of Jewish population were at the time. Major centers still in Israel, particularly in the northern part, the Galil, and also in Babylon. Then significant centers in Egypt and in Rome, and then smaller centers all around the Mediterranean basin and even in the Black Sea littoral over here. There are significant populations of Jews. With the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, Hadrian, an emperor who may have been initially more positively inclined towards the Jews, decides to crack down with tremendous brutality. And it is in the Hadrianic period, most likely after the Bar Kokhba revolt, that we have this period of martyrdom in Jewish history that remains in our liturgy to this day. The Eile Ezkara that we read on the high holidays, the Asara Hruge Malchut, the 10 martyrs of the state are described during this period, more or less, under Hadrian. And it looks like the Jewish people are really going to fall apart under the pressure and weight of the entire Roman Empire. And this is a time when a great leader of the Jewish people, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, comes up with this document called the Mishnah. I wish we had time to speak over and over again about the Mishnah. I will tell you, though, for those of you who are maybe not members of the shul, for the past 2 years, under leadership of Rabbi Teitelbaum and Rabbi Trump, and at the initiative of Rabbi Rothman, they've been learning Mishnah every single day after davening. The Yilk Yomi program had just started again, a new cycle, and over the course of about 5 years, they will finish the entire Mishnah. It is a huge document, and basically, On a surface level, I'm going to take this statement back, but for now, let's just say it's a law document. It's a document that deals primarily with law. And it's divided into 6 sections, which are listed here. Seeds, which deal primarily with agricultural law, all the laws that are in the Bible describing the sabbatical year, mixed fruits, the leaving corner for the poor, and things like that. Then there's a section on holidays, the Sabbath, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and so on. Then there's the largest section, which is on women. This is a very androcentric document. It's primarily written down by men, for men, and that's why the section explaining women requires the most amount of ink. Then right after women, it's a yeshiva joke. After you finish studying women, then you've got lots of damages to deal with. I'm sorry about that. Then number 5 and number 6 are dealing primarily with laws of the temple, and then pure things, which are primarily things dealing with personal purity. The laws of the mikvah, laws of Netilat Yadayim, things like that. Now, what's fascinating about the Mishnah, and I said it was a law document, it really isn't, because most law codes tell you what to do. The Mishnah preserves a phenomenal amount of ambiguity. It leaves a tremendous white space that makes it such a tremendously valuable document. At the time, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was assailed by his colleagues saying, how can you possibly write down this oral tradition that we have been handing down, rabbi to student for centuries? By putting it down in text, you are reifying it, you're setting it in concrete, it is inflexible, it will not be able to meet the challenge of the times, it will be a document that people will set aside like all the other documents of antiquity. I mean, how many people really read Virgil today? Maybe in college, yes, thank you. But you haven't read that in a while, I bet. But it's that they argue that that's what would happen. But Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, with phenomenal genius, made it a document of tremendous ambiguity. And it became the core of what we call today the Talmud. Now, again, I wish I had so much more time to speak. We would talk about what exactly the Talmud is. In a sentence, it is a massive, multi-author, multi-century commentary on the Mishnah, trying to explore what exactly the Mishnah is trying to talk about. And it has this beautiful space in the middle of it where the only way you can actually read it, it's not like reading any other kind of text, like a Greek text that has a beginning, a middle, and end, and chapter headings and things like that. It's a wide open conversation with literally 2,000 individuals speaking in it. Mainly rabbis, which is why it is so long, but also lots of other regular people, non-Jews, and all kinds of things. So the studying the Talmud has really become the core of the Jewish identity, especially Jewish intellectual activity, because it allows for the debate and the back and forth that has become synonymous really with Jewish character. The iconic image of yeshiva bochrim sitting in yeshiva and arguing about the meaning of the text goes to the very center of the Jewish spirit. Here's an example, a photograph of a Beis Medrash, where it's always studied, of course, at least in pairs with a chavrusa. The Gemara, the Talmud itself says, give me a study partner or give me death. It's so important. You cannot study the Talmud on your own. In fact, it's amazing. The Talmud says, if you study the Talmud alone, not only will you not learn anything, you will become stupider than you were before. That's actually what it says. I'm not making that up. And just to give you one little example. So this little story, when I went to yeshiva in Jerusalem, Yeshiva Or Sameach, this was right after the Soviet Union fell apart, and they had a lot of Russian boys there. And there was a problem because the boys were it was free food. If you remember the yeshiva, you had food served in the cafeteria. And a lot of the Russian boys, they lived through so much stress and so much change, and their whole country fell apart. So they tended to go back for second helpings, which they would then take up to their room. Just in case the yeshiva closed down between lunch and dinner, they wanted to make sure they had food. It was very expensive, it caused bugs, it was hard on the cleaning staff, and so on. So the yeshiva put up a sign right outside the front door of the dining hall that said, the yeshiva provides food for one portion only. No student is permitted to stand in line for second portion. Cruel but fair. By the time I finished lunch and came out, some yeshiva boy had subtly altered the sign to read, the yeshiva provides food for one portion only? No! Student is permitted to stand in line for second portion, right? This is what it means to study the Talmud. Every single word, every single detail has so many possible meanings, as the Talmud says. Just like when you strike a rock and 70 sparks fly out, 70 is a number meaning all the numbers, so too in every text there is a tremendous number of meanings. I have a friend who went to DePaul University, and he says that there used to be a lot of the seminary yeshiva boys who would come to the Law 101 class, and it was a big, banked auditorium, 250 students, and at the end of the lecture, the professor or the class would say, okay, if there are any boys from the local rabbinical seminary, please come downstairs. I'd like to speak with you after class. And then 6 or 7 of them come down, and he would say to them, listen, you leave me alone, and I'll leave you alone. Okay. Now, there were actually 2 Talmuds written at this time. Talmud, again, is basically a commentary on the Mishnah, a long, extended discussion of the Mishnah, very personality-oriented. The one that is lesser studied is so-called Jerusalem, although that's a bit of a misnomer because it was not written in Jerusalem. It was most likely written in Caesarea and in the Galil region. This is an aerial view of Caesarea, a town that was essentially built by Herod for the Romans. And so this Talmud it kind of became ignored as it was eclipsed by the much larger Babylonian Talmud, but the seam between those scholars who contributed to the Mishnah under Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and those that continue its discussion represent kind of a watershed in Jewish intellectual history. The former are called the Tanaim, and the latter are called the Amoraim, basically translated as the teachers and then the sayers. And write some more. Now, the Babylonian Talmud is a much larger Talmud that was composed not in Israel, but in the Mesopotamian region that we have visited earlier. And it is the most widely studied to this day. Here's where the Babylonian Talmud was primarily written, in the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here's a bit of a zoom in on that. I'm sorry, it's in Hebrew, but basically it refers to the 5 major committees, 5 noted centers of Jewish learning in Babylon: Sura, Pumbedita, Neharda, Mechoza, and Matamechasya. And if you think that it's all strange that there should be, these centers of Jewish learning on the rivers like that, have a look at our modern day rivers, right? Here's the iron rivers that I follow every day, the Long Island Railroad. And if you zoom in, you'll see there's, oh my gosh, the 5 towns, right? Like the 5 places in Sura and Pumbedisa. And here they are: Hewlett, Woodmere, Cedarhurst, Lawrence, Inwood, and some say even Far Rockaway. Okay, Rabbi, that's a joke. You can go now. Okay. All right. So the difference in the Jerusalem and the Babylonian Talmuds: the Jerusalem is a little bit smaller. It also is a little bit different in scope because the Jerusalem Talmud tends to concentrate on things that are relevant to the land of Israel, like, for example, the agricultural laws, which are not, for the most part, obligatory outside of the land of Israel. What is fascinating in our times is that now that Jews are living in the land of Israel again, they have to dig out these old manuscripts that had not been studied literally in centuries and rewrite commentaries on them that had never been authored, like new Rashis, new Tosfos. And it's absolutely brilliant to read these new commentaries. They're speaking about actual realia that they have to deal with in Israel today. Another fascinating thing is the Daf Yomi program, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's a very popular program. It started in 1923 and has revolutionized Talmud study. This is an idea that basically says, why don't we study one folio, that's a daf, 2 sides of 1 page, every single day, and over the course of 7.5 years, we will finish the entire Talmud. It's primarily the Babylonian Talmud that is studied. Just as a little push here for a project I'm involved with, very excited, called Al-Daf, which is taking all of the knowledge we have about the Talmud and about Daf Yomi and putting it onto an app, an absolutely amazing app, which is called Al-Daf, meaning the entire Daf, everything you want in there. It's led by this man here, Rabbi Moshe Shwed. We're going to be releasing it in January, God willing, with the new cycle of Daf Yomi. And it also features, not only I'm doing Jewish history on every single Daf, rather, I think, ambitious and audacious goal of 2,711 mini classes. But we also have our very own Rabbi Trump, who's going to be speaking about all of the scriptures that are actually in the Talmud. So that's kind of a fun local thing that we're doing, a huge thing. I'm very pleased with it. Okay, now that's the major intellectual innovation that allowed the Jews to survive the vicissitudes of the medieval period. We had an intellectual tradition, we had a body of ideas, and it was not a static body of ideas. It was something that invited engagement, that invited discussion, it invited communal study as well. So these are things that are extremely important for the intellectual life. But on a more pragmatic level, the other major innovation that allowed the Jews to survive was the creation of the Kehillah. So the word Kehillah is derived from the verb lekahal, or kahal, to congregate, to gather. You may have heard the phrase Kehillah Kadosha, holy community, holy congregation. It actually was a definitive structure of the Jewish community in diaspora that allowed the Jews to survive and even flourish in often hostile conditions. There are some minor differences in geography. Sephardic Kehillot tend to use slightly different terms. There might have been slightly different structure, but for the most part, I'm going to show you a generic Kehillah, and you'll probably note that it looks quite familiar to you. So if you look at a typical structure of a Kehillah, at the very top you have two people. You have someone called a Parnas, who, and the word is actually related to the word president in English, and that's basically the head of the Jewish community, the Kehillah, and alongside the Parnas is the rabbi. Now, it's an unusual kind of arrangement because the rabbi draws a salary from the community, and so in a very pragmatic way, the rabbi is dependent on the goodwill and has to have his contract renewed by the community, but at the same time, the rabbi is the noted expert and legal authority because of his knowledge of the Torah and his mastery of the Talmud. So it's a kind of a dynamic where there is two rulers of a community and they have to watch their step with each other. If the Parnas, were to get rid of a rabbi that's popular, the Parnas would be hard-pressed to maintain his position, and the rabbi at the same time cannot demand too much scrupulosity from his community, or he'll have a revolution on his own as well. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic between rabbi and Parnas. Below them are the so-called Tuvei Ha'ir, that's more of an Ashkenazic term, which is basically the board of directors. Every Jewish community had a board of directors called the good people of the city, and they would essentially appoint from their own ranks the Parnas, the president, usually on a rotating basis, and it was quasi-democratic. Women generally did not have the vote. Women generally did not sit on the Tuvei Ha'ir, and also non-propertied individuals did not sit on the Tuvei Ha'ir. This was kind of like an honor, but it was a responsibility of wealth as well. People who had means were expected to serve the community by guiding it in this leadership function. Alongside them, just like the Parnas had the rabbi beside him, the Beit Din was beside the Tuvei Ha'ir. The Beit Din is, of course, the court, the Jewish court of law, because the rabbi cannot rule on his own, particularly when you get to certain matters involving financial considerations. They would have a court that would be assembled of 3, sometimes 5 rabbis that would make decisions. And once again, the Tuvei Ha'ir, they may have wanted, let's say, like one thing that you see over and over again in the regulations of Jewish communities is a pushback on sumptuary legislation. Sumptuary legislation refers to literally how big a party you can throw. And over again, right up until, by the way, our own days with no signs of stopping, the rabbis are constantly trying to put limits on parties, and they will literally say, only 2 kinds of gefilte fish, and you can't have more than 100 people at this kind of event. And they actually try to put limits, but on the other hand, especially in times of prosperity, Jews will want to throw bigger and bigger parties. We are a gregarious people. We love parties. And so the herring just keeps flowing in, and the rabbis keep trying to hold it back. But that's a dynamism between the rabbis in the example of sumptuary laws, obviously in much other more serious examples as well, and the heads of the community. Below them are the so-called Gabayim. The word Gabbai is, today we have a Gabbai, we have that term used in the synagogue. That's the person who basically chooses who runs what parts of the service, who calls up whom to read from the Torah, who leads the services, all kinds of things like that. And it's, it doesn't seem to be an extremely high status position in a lot of ways. They certainly get not too much credit and a lot of tsuris, which is a lot of aggravation for doing it. But in the times of the Kehillah, the Gabayim were literally the enforcers, the muscle behind the decisions of the Beit Din and the Tuvei Ha'ir. As we shall see, for example, the Tuvei Ha'ir would assess your taxes to the community. And if you didn't pay, then you would have these Jewish muscular men come to your home and take it from you. They were literally collectors. They were tax collectors. They would also enforce unpopular legislation like forcing you to give a divorce bill to your estranged wife. And if you didn't do that, then you would be literally beat up. Corporal punishment was one of the tools that they could use. So the Gabayim were quite feared by the community that they lived in. We'll get back to that in a second. Below them, you had the so-called chevrot, which basically means committees. These are associations. Literally, the word chaver means friend or colleague. And this is really where the guts of the community works. You would have a whole slew of chevrot to deal with every possible social need and desire. Chevrot to assist travelers, chevrot to assist poor brides, chevrot to visit the sick, chevrot to learn this tractate or that tractate. Virtually every possible communal need was manned. I shouldn't say manned, because actually, whereas the top three levels were universally male, the bottom levels were predominantly female. The chevrot tended to be dominated by female leadership. And these are the women who actually got things done in the community. And below them, you have the Kehillah membership at large. Now, this probably looks a lot like the synagogue organization that you probably belong to. It certainly looks like Yilk, right? We have the same kind of structure. That's not an accident. This is basically the way that the synagogue, has evolved to this present day. What's a major difference, however, though, and we can't stress this enough, is that in our times, if you don't like the rabbi, you don't like the leadership, you can go to another synagogue, no problem. Or you can go to no synagogue. You can just simply opt out. In the Middle Ages, there was no secular identity. You were, by birth, in that community, and there was no middle ground. There was no way to simply say, you know what, I just don't want to affiliate. There's no such thing. The only way you could get out of being a part of the Kehillah was by converting to another religion, either Christianity or Islam. There was no secular identity in the Middle Ages. So it was quite a coercive institution, but it had a tremendous impact. So the authority, as I mentioned earlier, was, for example, they had to pay for this somehow, right? So taxation was a part of the Kehillah function. They would literally assess every member of the Kehillah's expected dues, and it was a progressive scale where the wealthier would certainly pay more and the poor would pay less. Some of the most fascinating documents we have track the way in which the poll tax was collected in the communities. If there was a head tax imposed by the non-Jewish government, then the Kehillah leaders had to figure out, okay, we have 1,000 people here and only 300 can pay the poll tax. How much are we going to charge those 300 and so on? How much is the 1% going to pay? How much is the 10% going to pay? And so on. So they had that authority, and there was no way to effectively oppose it. You could appeal it, and some of the most dramatic appeals, by the way, are by women who feel that they have been wronged. One of the time-honored traditions, which I do not recommend we adopt here at Yilk, I think it would backfire, is if a woman felt that she was really wronged by the authorities, then she would walk into the men's section in the middle of Shabbos davening and stand on the bima and effectively shut down the entire Shabbos. The herring is waiting in the Kiddush room and no one can get to it because she won't leave the bima, and she would demand right then and there that she gets a hearing on whatever issue was. So that's like kind of a very extreme form of protest. There were such things, but for the most part, you simply had to submit to the Kehillah authorities. They could also enact lots of proactive legislation, so-called takanot, that would regulate the affairs of the community as a whole, and this proved to be an extremely effective tool at maintaining group standards. Now, we already talked about enforcement, so let's go on. And so to try and summarize the value of the Kehillah, you notice I have lots of pictures of Fiddler on the Roof up here. I don't know, I feel very warm and happy about Fiddler on the Roof. The Kehillah, although, it may grate against our American sensibilities, in my case, North American sensibilities, because I'm from Canada, but it may grate against our sensibilities to say, who says the rabbi or the board of directors get to say how I should behave? We may not necessarily like that. But on the other hand, it maintained group standards and was a bulwark against assimilation. It was a kind of a way of drawing a border around the Jewish community, saying, hey, listen, we expect you to behave in these ways. And you had no choice rather than to submit to the Kehillah. When we get to the modern period, we will see how that breaks down in some very tragic ways, but that's for next week. It also relied heavily and imbued in Jewish culture at the level of DNA, communal charity. It was expected that the wealthier would provide for the less wealthy. That was part of being in a community, and if you were so blessed with wealth, that was your job, was to help those who were less well afforded. Right, so talk about communal standards. The apogee, the highest level of this, was a fascinating thing that happened a little bit later than our period for our discussion today, but it's relevant for our discussion. When all of the Kehilot from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea found themselves within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which in 15th century was the largest country in Europe as a result of a dynastic union, and all the Kehilot said, you know what? Why don't we standardize ourselves? Why don't we meet twice a year and make sure that we're imposing the same legislation on all our Kehilot? And this represented a phenomenal level of communal organization across. It's like when you think about the fact that there was no formal orphanage, there was no formal hospital, there was no formal social safety net in the non-Jewish world. And here, the Jews are organizing themselves to such a tremendous degree within a state. It represents a phenomenal level of civilization's accomplishment that was the height of the Kehillah structure. We will discuss next week how it broke down. I'll just give you a quick hint. There's two ways in which it broke down. The first is in Russia under Nicholas I, who imposed some extremely draconian measures, including the conscription, the forced conscription of Jewish children into the army, and demanding that the communal leaders, the Kehillah leaders, choose which Jewish children were forced to go into the army for, by the way, a 25-year term. And that was an extremely caustic decision that really tore apart the Kehillah. We'll discuss it, God willing, next week at greater length. So Nicholas I really crushed it out of existence in Russia, leaving only a little bit of it behind to perform taxation for the Tsarist state. And in the West, under Napoleon, with the freedoms that were given to the Jews, he demanded that this person, Rabbi David Sinsheim, convene a great Sanhedrin, which would determine exactly how the Kehillah is to exist within a modern citizen state in which Jews have freedom of religion and freedom of rights like every other citizen. And this was also quite damaging to the authority and the extent of the power of the Kehillah. We'll have to discuss it obviously more next week, but nevertheless, during the Middle Ages, it was an extremely powerful and useful device for the Jews to maintain their existence. Now, the next two sections refer to a bifurcation in the Jewish experience throughout the Middle Ages. For the most part, overwhelmingly, Jews found themselves under one of two civilizations, either under Islam or under Christianity. And the experience of Jews under those two civilizations varied tremendously. We're going to speak today in very broad terms and paint with broad strokes because we only have about 15 minutes to devote to it. But first, let us look at the period under Crescent, which refers to under the Islamic Crescent. Islam is born in the 7th century. It starts out, you can see in the darker brown area over here, in Mecca and Medina, and it spreads with amazing rapidity throughout the entire Mediterranean basin, also eastward through Persia into Afghanistan, where we would have today Pakistan and so on, and out to the west, all the way across the coast of North Africa, and in the year 711, for which we have named a chain of fast food places, that was a joke, I know, can't help it. They cross into Spain, and for several hundred years, Spain is actually Muslim. They are stopped from getting much past Constantinople, and Northern Europe remains Christian, but they dominated the entire southern part of the Mediterranean, which was, of course, the home to hundreds of thousands of Jews at the time. Now, under Islam, this is kind of like an ironic thing for us because unfortunately, we live in a time of phenomenal conflict with Muslim nations. This is centered absolutely in Israel with the Arab-Israeli conflict that has been going on for well over a century, and it tends to color much of our understanding of Jewish relations with Muslims. In the Middle Ages, however, on the balance, most scholars agree that it was far easier to live as a Jew under Islam than it was to live as a Jew under Christianity. There were punctuations of violence that we can certainly point to. Muhammad himself involved in the massacre of one Jewish tribe. But for the most part, speaking in generalization and comparing to the Christian environment, Islam treated Jews better for much of their mutual history. Part of the reason for this is because really Islam and Judaism have a far more common cultural vocabulary than does Judaism and Christianity. Judaism, like Islam, is primarily a religion of practice. We say orthodox, which means like one doctrine, but really it's one practice, orthopractic, which means, Judaism, and here I'm going to get in trouble, but the rabbi's already gone, he's left the room, that Judaism, for the most part, does not seem to care that much what you think. There are a few things that are really important, right? Like there is one God, life after death, okay, things like that are important. But you can run out of those ideas pretty quickly. On the other hand, if you want to ask Judaism how to behave, then you have years of study, keeping kosher and keeping the holidays and keeping the Sabbath and how to do business. It just goes on and on and on. So Islam is similar to this. Islam has a very practice-oriented sense of law as being identical with religion. They have something they call Sharia, which is broadly similar to something we call halakha. They actually translate the same, meaning the path or the way. And you can look at 100 different things, and you can see that Muslims and Jews, although they may not practice identically, they still understand what they're talking about. If a Muslim says, I can't eat this, I need to eat halal, we understand that. And they also understand what it means to keep kosher. There's so many areas in which there are cultural convergences. It's not accidental. They're both Middle Eastern faiths, and Islam is modeled very directly on Judaism in many ways. Christianity, on the other hand, is much more creed-based, much more what do you believe? Do you accept this person as your personal savior, and so on? And simply a statement of thought or a statement of belief is sufficient to garner significant rewards in heaven and so on. It's a very, very different kind of religion, very, very different kind of culture. So it stands to reason that, by and large, Muslims and Jews could fit together easier. There was a legislative act by the Muslims early on in the 9th century that made this clear and put this under clear auspices, the so-called Pact of Umar. Umar was one of the caliphs or the leaders of the Muslim world, and this document was probably created long after agreements were made between local Jewish communities and local Muslim leaders, but basically it purported to be a set of answers that Umar provided to Jewish leaders who were saying to him, okay, now Islam has taken over the territory in which we live, what are our rights and privileges? And Umar says, okay, fine. You may live in Muslim lands without fear of molestation. You may practice your faith because it is, under Islamic terms, a faith that was first granted by God. Moses was a prophet, Abraham was a prophet, and so on. But you may not, for example, proselytize. You may not build your synagogues larger than mosques. You may not wear certain colors that are associated with, high-level authorities. You may not bear weapons because carrying a weapon, a sword, is like a sign of dignity and respect and position and so on. But under these rules, then you're okay. And you are so-called dhimmi, or protected people. And this is the way that Jews lived for hundreds of years under Islam. We're talking about a situation in which there was obviously discrimination. This was a second-class status, but it was a safe status. And as a minority, historically, Jews are very comfortable living in mildly discriminatory environments as long as they are stable and predictable. The German word for it is a Rechtsstaat. which I love the way that sounds, Rechtsstaat. It sounds like you're about to spit or something, but it means a society based on laws. And that's why Jews flourished, for example, for pre-apartheid South Africa. Montreal was also a difficult place as well, because they knew that, okay, there are certain things that Jews simply couldn't get away with, but if someone threw a rock through your window, you could take that person to court and you would receive reparations. It was a society based on law. When societies break down and they have anarchy, that's when Jews become very nervous and they tend to leave. But a little bit of discrimination, some would argue, my colleague Heinz Dietrich Löwe would argue, for example, that it's actually good for Jewish civilization because it tends to force Jews together. It tends to reinforce the boundaries to assimilation in the outside society. The greatest example of this, what was called la convivencia, here's the living together time, was this brief period of time in Spain where Jews and Spaniards, Spanish Muslims, got along so well, it became the so-called Golden Age. It was looked on for hundreds of years as the greatest example of coexistence between Jews and non-Jews. It is somewhat exaggerated in the literature, but nevertheless, we cannot diminish the tremendous achievements of Jews in Spain during these 200 years. Just to give you a couple of examples, this is the Alhambra, by the way, which was the palace of a Jewish king at one point, well, not a king, Jewish vizier, prince at one time. Chasdai ibn Shaprut, an amazing doctor who was actually a very famous diet doctor. He used to coach people on how to lose weight. And he rose to tremendous fame, you know, like my father would say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. He rose to become a phenomenal diplomat in a Muslim court in Spain. Let's also not forget, by the way, that Spain is far away. It's a peripheral culture compared to the centers which are happening primarily in Baghdad, both for Muslims and for Jews. They were far away from the centers, so they'd get away with a lot of things they wouldn't necessarily do where the major population centers were. He communicated even with the purported king of the Khazar Empire, which is a rather bizarre story about a group of Turks who converted to Judaism in the year 740. It's a bizarre story. We don't have time for it now, but if you're curious, I have lectures on it. Another figure, amazing, Shmuel HaNagid, who actually wrote a commentary on the Talmud, which we can find in the library right now. It's printed in every Talmud. A brilliant scholar who was also the Jewish general of a Muslim army for 16 years. Now, if you think about it for a second, one of the geniuses of Spanish Jewry, which is so amazing, you know, when you look at our cultures, in fact, most Jewish cultures, you find that Jewish excellence is usually either expressed in terms of something within the Jewish community, like a great Torah scholar or something, like a great Chazan, something like that, or it's expressed in the secular community, like an Einstein or something like that. You never have someone doing both those things. So could you imagine some guy who was a Rosh Yeshiva in Lakewood, who was also the general of the American army at the same time? It's just so mind-boggling, and yet this is what was happening in Granada under Shmuel HaNagid. I'm not going to address that one. But this is the kind of person he was. And he wrote poetry as well. He used to, it's amazing, he used to write poetry from the battlefield. He maintained right up to the very end of his life, he was at the front lines. He would write poetry and then tie it to the legs of carrier pigeons to fly home to his son, who would collect it into a diwan that eventually has reached us to today. Amazing poetry. And then Yehuda Halevi, for another example, a phenomenal poet-philosopher. We should understand that Spanish Jewish society was so amazing at the time. They actually had riots in the streets between Jews. I mean, Jews actually fighting each other physically over poetry. Because there was this guy named Dunash ibn Labrat who came from Baghdad, and he said, hey, listen, I've got a great idea. Why don't we adapt Arabic meter to Hebrew poetry? And all of a sudden, particularly by manipulating how you count the value of a shva vowel, you could make Hebrew poems sound so much better. And so there were actually riots in the streets between Jews who were traditionalists, says, no, we want the old poetry. We will not accept this newfangled poetry influenced by Arabic poetry. And you had the youngsters who were saying, oh, this Arabic poetry is great. It's like rock and roll. We have to have it. Can you imagine? We don't have those kinds of fights today. We fight about silly things. They fought about poetry. So let me give you a couple of examples of Yehuda Halevi's amazing poetry. Here's one Give you a sense of the range of their poetry. And by the way, there are poems that both Shmuel HaNagid and Yehuda Halevi wrote that are too X-rated to be discussed in shul. I'm going to give you some easier ones. This is Afra, and if I'll read it in Hebrew in an attempt to do a Sephardic accent. Notice the way the meter at the end of each line drops off before it continues in the second line. It's very beautiful in Hebrew. Afra techabet et begadeha b'mei dim'i v'tishchatet l'shemesh zahara lo sha'ala mei haya'anot im shtei einai v'lo shemesh l'lofi ta'ara. If you remember that song that came out a little while ago, not a Jewish song, I would take a grenade for ya. I would jump in front of a train for ya. Right? You know, it's the same actually meter of Yehuda Halevi. But what's the English here? Ofra, which is a woman's name, does her laundry in my tears, right? Because she has rejected me as a lover. She will not have anything to do with me. So I'm crying so much that she says, oh, look at all this. I've got this great water. I can use this to wash her laundry. And then because she is so radiant, she dries it in the sunshine she gives off. She doesn't have to take it to the trough. She doesn't have to her laundry can get washed right because I'm crying so much in front of her. Or wait to hang it till the weather clears. And the range of poetry is incredible. Here's another one that Yehuda Halevi initially was a poet for hire. Again, totally foreign society to us. People would pay poets to come to their weddings, to come to their funerals, and make up poetry on the spot. That was what they did. We don't do that. We pay people to bring herring. I think I need to have some herring. But this is something incredible. So this one here, it's actually just the first stanza of a multiple stanza poem that deals with, it's spoken from different voices on the death of a daughter. Chas v'shalom lo aleinu. And it begins. This is the father speaking. Later the mother will speak, and then ultimately the dead daughter herself will speak of her experience. Ha biti hashachat mishkanech. כי לשאול נשוא נושא ארונך, ואין חלק ממך רק זיכרונך, ואחונן את עפרות ציונך. עת אסור לשאול לשלומך ועינך, כי המוות יפריד ביני ובינך. I'm emotional just thinking about it. Each one of those stanzas ends in that second person nech sound, and it flows off the tongue and expresses a sadness that cannot be uttered in regular prose. So this gives you a sense of the height of civilization in the Spanish Golden Age. But the greatest of them all, of course, is the so-called great eagle, Maimonides himself. And we cannot justify a discussion of Maimonides with anything less than the hours. But he made two signal contributions which are overwhelming in their import and reached well beyond the parameters of Jewish society. He revolutionized the study of Torah by saying, you know what, it's so complicated, the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Torah, I can't even keep them all straight. He didn't say that, I said that. But he said, I'm just going to restate the whole thing in a common language, in simple Hebrew, that basically 7th graders can read the entire Torah start to finish. All the laws organized, you can look it up for yourself. You don't need to run to the rabbi every minute for every question. This is part of the reason he got in trouble, because the rabbi said, hey, you're putting us out of work here. But he essentially revolutionized the whole thing by saying, I'm just going to make it easy for you. And at the same time, although he was a populist and he wrote this for the masses, he also wrote a soaring philosophical classic called the Mavo Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, which led the confused reader who was doubting Judaism because of the impact of Islamic philosophy through a sophisticated, philosophically astute understanding of what it is all about. So with those two directions, he revolutionized Judaism really for millennia. Of course, he was hated for it in many circles, and his own books were burned at Jewish insistence in the year 1232, which set off a whole cycle of negativity for European Jews afterwards. But we'll have to discuss that next week. So that's basically the experience under Islam. I've painted a bit of a rosy picture because we only have a little bit of time. There were definitely moments of violence. There were definitely fissures in this otherwise beautiful kind of coexistence, but it paled by comparison to what's happening under the cross. So like the Pact of Umar, Christianity has something called the doctrine of witness. But because Christianity is so much closer to Judaism than Islam, the every single dispute is magnified. If you think of it like this, Judaism is the mother religion, and then you have Christianity, the daughter religion, and then you have Islam, the granddaughter religion. So fights between mother and daughter are very common, and they sometimes can be very bitter and nasty and lasting. Fights between grandmother and granddaughter, not so much, right? Because by the time you're a grandmother, and they're so cute and little, and you have perspective on life, you can tolerate a lot more. So that's kind of like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The fight between Judaism and Christianity tends to be quite nasty. But in the 4th century, St. Augustine came up with something called the Doctrine of Witness. It said, just like Umar was asked, what are we supposed to do? What are the rights and privileges of Jews? Augustine said, you know what, we have to figure out what's our relationship to the Jewish people now. Christianity is now the state religion, the Roman Empire. Jews are now the minority. We have the power. What should we do with them? He said, first of all, slay them not. We should not kill them all, which, Baruch Hashem, we have to thank St. Augustine for that. He said there is a place in Christian society for Jews. What is that place? We have to serve as witnesses when the second coming occurs. Meaning that we Jews have to be alive such that when the Messiah comes the second time, we'll be able to sort of slap our heads and say, man, we should have gone with the V8. I mean, we should have gone with the first one. Now we can really confirm that, yes, this is in fact the Messiah. That's the witnessing, the testifying that Jews are. So what that meant was, Jews should be allowed to practice their faith quietly, like under Islam with the Pact of Umar, but they should not be destroyed. Forced baptism was technically illegal, but nevertheless widely ignored. Certainly murdering them was contrary to church practice. Now, that meant there were some ambiguities in that, though, because what happens if there's another aspect of witness I should mention, that even before the second coming, Jews are supposed to witness in their abject and depressed state that this is what happens to people who reject the Messiah, right? As long as we are walking around moping and sad and degraded, then you can point to Jews and say, look, see, that's what happened to those people because of what they did back in the 1st century. But what happens if the Jews are driving around in Mercedes-Benz and they're wearing fine clothes and they're wealthy and having plenty of time off and things like that, vacations, then it's not working. And so therefore, one of the ambiguities that was present in the Doctrine of Witnesses, there was a forced humiliation of Jews in all kinds of different contexts. Sometimes it was a literal thing like the head of the Jewish community would have to present himself on Easter to the mayor of the town for a ritual slap in the face. Sometimes it was forced sermons. But perhaps the most common element was in the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, Jews were required to wear a humiliating distinguishing badge. Sometimes it was shown, as you see here, as the 2 tablets of the law. Sometimes it was a ruel, which represented the coins that Judas received for betraying his master. And sometimes it was this kind of coned hat called the Judenhut, which later evolved into the witch's cap and to the dunce cap, which some of you may remember what it was like. My father used to tell me about how he would be forced to wear the dunce cap and sit in the corner. It goes back to this Jewish hat that Jews were forced to wear in some European communities as a humiliation. It was usually yellow, sometimes red, and there are variations, and there are ways that Jews could buy their way out of it as well. Some communities were more lenient, you could bribe your way out, but this is an example of the humiliation. A lot of it had to do with economics, because there's a strange loophole in Christian law called the Law of Gratian, which says that Christians may not lend money to other Christians and charge interest. So this basically stops all economic activity past barter, because who wants to, give away their capital on a risky venture if you're not going to get any kind of return? However, Jews, because they are not Christians, are allowed to lend money to Christians, and so the Jews, ironically, for a couple hundred years, had the monopoly on providing credit. Credit was, as you see in this picture here, very popular. This is a Jew seated with the Judenhut. He's got a whole bunch of coins here. This is an abacus, which is a primitive calculator. And here's a non-Jew who's coming with his hands out asking for money. You can see his pockets were empty. He doesn't even have clothes. shoe. You know, I try that joke every time. Nobody ever gets it, right? He's wearing hose. I will cut it out of the internet. That's it. Okay. And so there was there's this widespread thing that came out in the 19th century where people felt that, Jews were forced into money lending because they couldn't own land. In reality, in most parts of Europe, for most of our history, we could own land, but we didn't want to own land. Owning land meant you were trapped where you were living, and if you got evicted from the country, you would have no recourse. That was it for your land. On the other hand, we were urban, we were literate and numerate. We had the skills. You could convert your knowledge into cash and currency, which could be carried, which could be transported. And so it was actually a very appealing option for Jews as well. Lots of pragmatic applications. But and a related occupation, which we'll have to talk about more next time because I'm running out of time, would be tax farming. We'll just put a place marker on it. The risks, however, are significant. If, as Jews often loaned money to the nobility, and then that debt burden got too large, then the nobility could simply say, you know what, it's not worth it for us to keep the Jews in place and keep maintaining this debt. It's easier simply to expel them, as they did, for example, in England in 1290. They simply said the debt is too large, let's get rid of the creditors. And that was the end of it. So it has those risks. And also significant risks if Jews are small-time money lenders, like they were, for example, in Ukraine. You could have a massive peasant uprising in which the local population is just so sick of the debt burden that they say it's easier for us to massacre the Jews. Even though credit is something that everybody wants when they need it, when they have to pay for it, it's a different story. We shall return to this as well. I would like to spend a couple of minutes talking about anti-Semitism, which develops very significantly in Christian Europe. This is not something we see anything like this in the Muslim world. When I was studying in Oxford at one point, I was working with a scholar there, and we actually tried to count the number of anti-Semitic publications written, authored in Muslim lands during the Middle Ages, and it was hard for us to get past 20. But Christian works, oh my gosh, hundreds, is a tremendously different environment. This is a classic image that was used to illustrate the difference between Judaism and Christianity. It's so-called ecclesia et synagoga. And this was especially useful if you were speaking to illiterate audiences. So this was a female figure representing the church. You can see that she's got a crown on, she's standing upright, she has this staff which represents her power and authority. She's holding the chalice, that is the Holy Grail, and she's generally a respectable figure. Her sister, so to speak, this is, by the way, outside a cathedral in Strasbourg, she represents synagoga. Her crown is removed from her head, she's blindfolded to the truth. The staff in her arms is broken, indicating that her power is gone. She's holding the two tablets of the law, but loosely, like they're falling out of her hands. She's not even holding on to Judaism properly. And her whole physical posture is one of decline. And the message, if you're a peasant coming into Strasbourg and you want to learn something about your religion, then the priest or the deacon can point up to it and they point all of these things out, and you can get a pretty sophisticated, although negative view of Judaism. This image of the church and synagogue, there are literally thousands of examples in medieval Christian Europe. I'll just show you two more. Here's another one that shows that it can actually get quite violent. Here is the church who is actually launching a lance into the synagogue. She's wearing the Judenhut here, and that's a rather nasty one. Here's one of my favorites from 14th century Germany. I don't know why I say my favorite, but that's weird. This is a stained glass window. This is in a church, right? In a church. This is the ecclesia, and she's got the upright staff, the Holy Grail. She's riding on a tetramorph, and a hand descends from heaven and crowns her, indicating divine approval. Synagoga, on the other hand, is riding on a donkey, a sterile animal, holding on to the carnal head of a ram, and a broken staff, blindfolded, and in case you missed the point, a bloody sword descends from heaven and punctures the top of her skull, knocking off her crown. It's hard to imagine a more negative statement of another religion than something like this. And that's the kind of anti-Semitism that is building up in Christian Europe. It gets to its worst with the so-called blood libel, which begins in the 13th century, the notion that Jews somehow need to consume Christian blood for whatever reason, arguments that Jewish men menstruated, they need to replace their iron. the idea that Jews had a unique stench called the Foiter Iudaeus, and the only way to get rid of it was to bathe in Christian blood. And of course, the association with the Passover matzah and wine and things like that. This is a rendition of Simon of Trent in 1479, a child who was unfortunately murdered in mysterious circumstances, probably by a maniacal pedophile. And once his body was discovered, the Jews were blamed for it. He was actually sainted. He is a saint in the church today. Obviously, I need to say it for the internet, this is totally ridiculous. Jews do not do this. We don't even put sugar in our matzah. Forget about blood. I would like to spend more time talking about this, but I know I am rushing out of time, and we have to get to the Spanish Inquisition. But a similar thing was the desecration of the host, which is a charge that Jews would take, if they couldn't get a Christian child, they would take the wafer that is a part of the Christian rite of communion, Catholic rite of communion, and then they would torture the host itself. I'm talking about the crackers itself, and this is referring to a host desecration charge in Passau, in which many Jews lost their lives as a result of a mass hysteria. Okay, now we have to get to the Spanish Inquisition. I hope you will forgive me if I go maybe 4 minutes over time. I spent too much time talking about Rabbi Trump. So you have in the Middle Ages a tremendous number of expulsions. We're going to look at the greatest of them, the Spanish expulsion of 1492, but really there are tens, maybe hundreds of smaller expulsions from local cities, principalities, dukedoms, fiefdoms, and kingdoms. There's a joke, it's no longer true, but they used to say, why is it that there are no good Jewish piano players? And the answer was, because it's hard to run when you're carrying a piano. The clarinet is much easier. But that's no longer true. But you can see that there's a general push from Western Europe towards Eastern Europe. And especially in the 16th century, you've got lots of Jews beginning to populate the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. About 75% of Ashkenazic Jews in America descend from those Jews who made their way from Ashkenazic lands. Ashkenaz is, by the way, Germany, most likely the Rhineland, into Eastern Europe. The Spanish Inquisition was one of these bizarre, purge-like, terrifying nightmares of society that took over a century to resolve itself in the Iberian Peninsula and had ramifications for the next century as well. What basically happened? This is, by the way, an instrument of torture associated with the Spanish Inquisition, which was initiated in 1478 and was not closed until the 19th century. The person who was being inquired of would put his hands in this press, and he would stare at the cross to contemplate his sins while he was tortured, and would be encouraged to confess while under such tremendous duress. Basically what happened is, in the late 14th century, there is a wave of forced baptisms in Spain. And as you recall, I mentioned earlier under St. Augustine, this is prohibited behavior, but nevertheless, in Catholic doctrine, once a person is baptized, they become they become Christian. There's no way back. There's no way out of Catholicism if you have been baptized. So all of a sudden you had all these Jews in major Spanish cities who were no longer considered Jewish, which meant on the one hand they were kind of like stateless peoples because they were, the Jewish community wasn't entirely sure what to do with them either. But, and here's the trick, they ended up having tremendous social mobility, because if they were actually Catholics, then there was no more anti-Semitic legislation that could hold them back. They could go to university, they could have whatever job they want, they could even rise up, as many did, high in the church. And all of a sudden you had this very talented, urban, literate, numerate, experienced community able to find all kinds of economic activities that they never had before. They were called crypto-Jews, which means hidden Jews. They were called by their detractors marranos, which means basically swine or pigs. But they were all of a sudden Christians in legal aspects, but they still remained Jews internally. And the Inquisition was all of a sudden brought in because what do we do with all these people? They're still hanging out with the Jewish community. They're still going to eat kosher meat. They're still going and marrying other Marranos and so on. How do we stop these people who are literally overrunning the major cultural, social, and economic institutions of Spain? So the Inquisition was brought in to try and enforce that all these people and their children and their grandchildren who were baptized would remain Christians and would not backslide into Judaism. So to be clear, the Inquisition was not, strictly speaking, directed against Jews. Jews living in Spain, this, by the way, is Christian Spain, but I should make obvious. The Muslims were driven out in 1482. The last Muslim kingdom was removed. Jews, per se, were left alone by the Inquisition because they were heretics, but they had their heretical community and they had the right to live within that community. This was directed at those Jews and their descendants who were baptized and who had the rights of Christians, but were still practicing Jewish activity. And in order to capture them, they would arrest one of them, subject them to torture. They would, under torture, under duress, they would say, oh, these are 7 other people I know doing the same thing, and they would arrest those 7 people, and then those 7 people would give up 7 more people, and it ended up spinning way out of control. Just to give you one sense of what that looked like, the torture. This is a device, and the Spanish Inquisition was notorious for these kinds of things. This is a device called the Pope's Pear, and they would take a suspected Judaizer, a crypto-Jew. They would insert this device in the orifice of their choice, and then they would ask him to give up the names, or her, of their fellow Judaizers. And if they didn't give a satisfactory answer, then they would simply turn that little ring and it would increase like this. You just imagine seeing these devices of torture. There's so many pictures I simply cannot show you. So what ended up happening was, I'm going to have to skip through this for time. There's so much to say about it. But it was a huge failure. They simply could not keep up with the number of Judaizers. And the logic of it began to break down such that Torquemada, the chief inquisitor, simply said, you know what, I think I've got the answer. The reason why we can't control this is because the false Christians, so to speak, are still in association with the Jewish community. What we have to do is we have to get rid of all the Jews. If we get rid of all the Jews, then they will naturally assimilate to Christianity. And this is ultimately what drove the king and queen to adopt the right of expulsion in the year 1492. There were also economic reasons for this. I'm simply run out of time to tell you the distinction between scholars who believe it was primarily religious in nature, other scholars believe it was primarily economic in nature. But what you had in 1492 was an absolutely tragic, massive exile of this huge population. If you can just imagine what it must have been like for these Jews, it would be something like driving all the Jews out of the 5 boroughs of Manhattan and New York as a whole. Impossible to imagine, and yet that's what it was, creating a ripple in Jewish society that lasted for hundreds of years. And we will continue that, God willing, next week. Let me just conclude by saying, last week, when we looked at the ancient period, and I managed to stay amazingly within 60 minutes, my takeaway message was that the Jewish people were phenomenally resilient, that they were able to absorb phenomenal abuse and still continue their gregarious, life-affirming ways. What I'd like to say about today is from when we look at the medieval period, we have to say the Jewish people are incredibly resourceful. There are people that are able to look at devastation and to nevertheless suss out those elements that can be used to recreate life even from the ashes. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope to see you next week.